What drives a man who has already conquered the largest empire in the known world to keep moving, keep fighting, and refuse to turn back? In 13 years of continuous campaigning, a Macedonian king crossed 3 continents, defeated armies many times the size of his own, and created an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India. Life ended at the age of 32. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Alexander is one of the most written about figures in all of history, which makes it easy to miss what is actually strange and significant about him, which is not the scale of his conquest, but the nature of what he left behind. Tonight, we turn to a king whose campaigns reshaped the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world so thoroughly that their effects are still visible in the languages, cities, and intellectual traditions of the Mediterranean and the Near East. The question is not whether Alexander was great, but what kind of greatness he embodied, and what the world he created tells us about the relationship between military power and cultural transformation.
Alexander's military campaigns are among the most studied in history, but his most durable achievement was not the conquest of the Persian Empire. It was the creation of the Hellenistic world, a vast cultural zone in which Greek language, art, philosophy, and scientific practice spread across societies that had never previously been in sustained contact with Greek civilization.
We are speaking about Alexander III of Macedon, known as Alexander the Great, and his significance as a military commander and as the architect of the Hellenistic age.
He lived for 32 years and campaigned for 13. In that time he transformed the political map of the ancient world more completely than any other individual before or since. The question of how he did it, and what it cost, is the question this episode tries to answer.
Then let us begin with the world Alexander inherited, and the formation that prepared him to transform it.
Alexander was born in 356 before the Common Era in Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom. His father was Philip II, one of the most capable military and political organizers of the ancient world. Philip had transformed Macedonia from a peripheral and frequently invaded kingdom into the dominant military power in the Greek world, developing the Macedonian phalanx into a formation of exceptional discipline and effectiveness. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus whose intense religious devotion and fierce temperament left a deep mark on her son. The court of Philip was politically volatile. Philip had multiple wives and competing claims to succession. Alexander grew up in an environment of ambition, rivalry, and genuine physical danger, which shaped both his extraordinary drive and his pronounced tendency toward suspicion of those closest to him.
So the court that formed him was also the court that threatened him.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Alexander is often presented as a product of Aristotle's philosophical education, a philosopher king whose intellectual formation set him apart from ordinary conquerors. In reality, Aristotle's influence on Alexander's governing practice was limited. What Aristotle gave him was curiosity, a habit of systematic observation, and a framework for thinking about different peoples and their but the military and political instincts that defined his campaign came from Philip, and from the brutal education of the Macedonian court. Aristotle tutored Alexander from approximately 343 to 340 before the Common Era, when Alexander was between 13 and 16 years old. The school was held at Mysa, in a park near Pella, and included other young Macedonian nobles who would later become Alexander's generals. The intellectual formation of this group created bonds that lasted throughout the campaigns.
So Aristotle educated not just Alexander, but the command structure of the entire future empire.
Exactly. Philip was assassinated in 336 before the Common Era, possibly with Olympias's involvement, possibly with Alexander's knowledge. Alexander was 20 years old. He moved with extraordinary speed to eliminate potential rivals, consolidate the loyalty of the Macedonian army, and assert his authority over the Greek city-states that Philip had brought under Macedonian leadership. Within 2 years he had secured his position and launched the invasion of Persia. The Persian Empire under Darius III was by far the largest political entity in the known world, stretching from Egypt and Anatolia in the west to the borders of India in the east. It commanded vastly greater resources than Macedonia, and could field armies many times the size of Alexander's force. The conventional expectation was that the Persian Empire, whatever its internal difficulties, was too large and too wealthy to be conquered by a Macedonian king with limited financial resources and an army of perhaps 40,000 men.
So the conventional expectation was wrong from the very beginning.
Yes. The Battle of Granicus in 334 before the Common Era, the first major engagement of the campaign, demonstrated the tactical principle that would define Alexander's victories throughout: forward movement at the decisive point, combined with the precision of the Macedonian phalanx to fix the enemy line, and the hammer of the companion cavalry to break it. Alexander himself led the cavalry charge, placing himself at the point of maximum danger in every major battle.
So his physical presence at the center of each battle was itself a tactical element.
Precisely. And this created a bond with his soldiers that no amount of pay or reward could have produced. He was wounded multiple times in battle, sometimes seriously. His men knew that whatever they were risking, their king was risking the same. This was not symbolic leadership from a safe distance. It was genuine shared danger, and it explains the extraordinary loyalty his army maintained through years of grueling campaigning far from home. The Battle of Issus in 333 before the Common Era brought Alexander face to face with Darius himself. The Persian king had assembled an enormous force on terrain that favored numbers. Alexander again attacked directly, driving toward Darius's position with his cavalry, while the phalanx held the Persian line. Darius fled before the battle was decided, abandoning his family and his treasury. Alexander treated the royal family with deliberate courtesy, a gesture that served both his personal code and his political strategy of presenting himself as a legitimate heir to Persian imperial authority rather than a foreign conqueror. Egypt welcomed Alexander without significant resistance in 332 before the Common Era. The Egyptians had chafed under Persian rule and received the Macedonian king as a liberator. He was recognized as pharaoh and made a significant journey to the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, deep in the western desert, where he received a response that he never fully disclosed but that reinforced his sense of divine mission. He founded Alexandria on the Egyptian coast, the first and most enduring of the many cities he would establish across his empire.
So Alexandria was not a military fortification, but a planned city designed to serve as a commercial and cultural hub.
Yes, and this is the turning point in how we should understand what Alexander was doing. The cities he founded across his empire were not simply administrative posts or military garrisons. They were instruments of cultural transformation, centers where Greek settlers, local populations, and traders from across the known world would interact and create something new. Alexandria became the greatest city in the ancient world within a generation of his death, home to the Library of Alexandria and the intellectual culture of the Hellenistic age. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 before the Common Era was the decisive engagement of the campaign. Darius had assembled perhaps 1 million men, though ancient sources routinely exaggerate numbers and modern estimates are considerably lower. Alexander had approximately 47,000. The Persian force included war elephants, scythe chariots, and cavalry units from across the empire. Alexander's response was a tactical masterpiece of controlled aggression, creating a gap in the Persian line and driving directly for Darius. Darius again fled. The Persian Empire effectively ended that day.
So the largest empire in the ancient world was broken in a single afternoon.
Yes, Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, was taken, and its palace complex burned, an act whose deliberateness or accidental nature has been debated by historians ever since. Darius was subsequently captured and killed by his own subordinates before Alexander could reach him. Alexander gave the dead king a royal funeral, assuming the mantle of his legitimate successor rather than his conqueror. The campaigns that followed took Alexander through Bactria and Sogdia, the regions of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, where the resistance proved far more difficult than anything he had faced in Persia. Guerrilla warfare in harsh mountain terrain against determined local populations stretched his army and tested his patience. He married Roxanne, a Bactrian noblewoman, in 327 before the Common Era, a marriage that served both personal and political purposes, and that produced his only legitimate heir.
So, the further east he went, the harder the resistance became, and the more he had to adapt his methods.
Yes, and his personal behavior became more volatile under the strain. In 328 before the Common Era, at a banquet in Samarkand, Alexander killed his cavalry commander Clytus in a drunken quarrel. Clytus had saved his life at Granicus. The killing horrified Alexander himself, who spent days in grief before being persuaded by his court to resume his duties. It was one of several incidents in the later campaigns that raised questions about the psychological cost of years of continuous warfare. The siege of Tyre in 332 before the Common Era is one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, and one of the most revealing episodes of Alexander's character. Tyre was an island city off the coast of what is now Lebanon, considered virtually impregnable because of its position in the sea. Alexander responded by building a causeway from the mainland to the island, a construction project that took 7 months under constant attack from the Tyrian defenders. When the city finally fell, Alexander had thousands of its defenders killed and sold the surviving population into slavery.
So the same campaign that produced Alexandria also produced the destruction of Tyre.
Yes, and this juxtaposition is essential to understanding Alexander. Honest, the founding of cities and the destruction of cities were both instruments of his imperial project. Cities that submitted received good treatment and often flourished under his administration. Cities that resisted were examples, destroyed precisely because their destruction would make future resistance seem futile. The Hellenistic world was built with both methods simultaneously. His policy of adopting Persian administrative practices and court customs was one of the most controversial decisions of his reign among his Macedonian followers. He began wearing Persian dress, adopted elements of the Persian court ceremony, including the practice of proskynesis, the prostration before the king, and encouraged his commanders to marry Persian noblewomen. Many of his Macedonian veterans viewed these practices as a betrayal of their cultural identity, and a sign that Alexander was becoming what they had set out to destroy.
So his attempt to create a unified Macedonian and Persian ruling culture alienated the very men who had made his conquests possible.
Yes, this tension ran through the final years of his campaign and contributed to the paranoia and violence of his later behavior. The killing of his general Philotas and the subsequent execution of Philotas's father Parmenion, Alexander's most senior commander, in 330 before the Common Era, removed the last significant internal check on his authority. Whether the conspiracy charges against Philotas were genuine is debated. What is clear is that Alexander used them to eliminate a family that represented the old Macedonian military aristocracy's claim to independent standing.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to follow Alexander's campaigns and understand the world he created, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Alexander the Great by Philip Freeman.
So this is a biography that takes the military campaign seriously, without losing sight of the cultural transformation they produced.
Freeman presents a clear and engaging account of Alexander's life and campaigns, drawing on ancient sources and modern historical analysis. He traces Alexander's rise from Macedonian prince to ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India, examining the military strategies, political decisions, and personal ambitions that shaped his career, while also exploring the cultural transformations that followed his conquests.
Is it accessible to readers who are coming to ancient history for the first time?
Freeman writes with clarity and narrative moment. The book does not require prior knowledge of the ancient world. It builds its context as it goes and keeps the reader oriented through the complexity of the campaigns. It is one of the most readable introductions to Alexander available.
So it gives the reader both a story of the man and a framework for understanding the Hellenistic world he created.
Precisely. And Freeman does not romanticize Alexander. The book is honest about the violence of the campaigns, the destruction of cities, and the personal deterioration of the later years.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Alexander's campaign into India, beginning in 327 before the Common Era, pushed his army to its limits. The Battle of the Hydaspes against the Indian king Porus in 326 was one of his most difficult engagements. Fought across a flooded river against an army that included war elephants. He won, but the army refused to go further. At the Hyphasis River his soldiers mutinied. After days of argument, Alexander agreed to turn back. It was the only time in his career that his men refused to follow him. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert was catastrophic. Alexander led the army through one of the most inhospitable regions in the world, possibly as a deliberate test of endurance, possibly due miscalculation about the conditions they would face. Thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and animals perished. It remains one of the darkest episodes of the campaign.
So the return from India cost more lives than many of the battles that had built the empire.
Yes. Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, where he was planning further campaigns, possibly into Arabia. He passed away in June of that year, aged 32. The cause of his death has been debated for 2,000 years. Fever, possibly typhoid. aggravated by heavy drinking, and a body worn down by years of wounds and campaigning, is the most widely accepted explanation. Poison has never been definitively ruled out. He left no designated successor. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, he reportedly said to the strongest. His generals, the Diadochi, spent the following decades in a series of brutal wars that divided the empire into a collection of competing kingdoms. The unified empire he had built survived him by less than a year as a political entity.
So the empire that took 13 years to build was divided within months of his death.
Yes, but the cultural transformation his campaigns had set in motion was not reversible. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the division of his empire, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East and Central Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, as the language of administration and culture, continued his policy of founding cities, and presided over a centuries-long process of cultural exchange between Greek and Eastern traditions. The immediate intellectual legacy was concentrated above all in Alexandria, where the museum and library created by the Ptolemaic dynasty became the greatest center of scientific and philosophical inquiry in the ancient world. Euclid wrote his geometry there. Archimedes studied there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there. The intellectual achievements of the Hellenistic age were a direct consequence of the cultural infrastructure that Alexander's conquests made possible.
So the Library of Alexandria and everything it represented was, in a real sense, a product of Alexander's campaigns.
Exact, and this is the most enduring and most often overlooked dimension of his legacy. The spread of the Greek language as a common tongue across the Near East and the Mediterranean created a shared intellectual infrastructure that outlasted his empire by centuries. When the authors of the New Testament wrote in Greek rather than Aramaic, they were writing in a language that remained the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean precisely because Alexander had made it so. The complications of his legacy are considerable. His campaigns killed hundreds of thousands of people. Cities that resisted were destroyed with extreme violence. The siege and destruction of Tyre, and the destruction of the Persian city of Persepolis were acts of deliberate brutality. The forced marriages of Macedonian soldiers to Asian women at Susa, intended to create a new mixed ruling class, were carried out without the consent of the women involved. The Hellenistic world he created was built on enormous human suffering.
So the cultural flowering of the Hellenistic age rested on foundations of conquest and coercion.
Yes. And this tension is not incidental to Alexander's story. It is the center of it. He was simultaneously a destroyer of existing orders and a creator of new ones. A figure whose ambition caused immeasurable suffering, and whose campaigns produced a cultural legacy that shaped the intellectual and religious history of the Western world for 2 millennia. Understanding both dimensions together, rather than choosing one and ignoring the other, is what historical seriousness requires. His modern relevance lies in the questions his story poses about ambition, cultural exchange, and the relationship between military power and lasting change. Empires built by force have rarely endured in the form their founders intended. But the cultural mixing that military conquest sometimes produces can outlast the empires themselves by thousands of years. Alexander is the most dramatic example in history of both facts operating simultaneously.
So Alexander is not simply a military story. He is a question about what conquest actually produces and at what cost.
Precisely. And every generation answers that question differently, which is why he remains one of the most debated figures in all of history, and why the debate still tells us as much about those doing the debating as it does about the man himself.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the campaigns, the cities, the battles, and the long shadow Alexander cast over the ancient world, and everything that came after it.
Alexander reminds us that the most consequential figures in history are rarely the ones who intended the consequences they produce.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.